18,000 people watched Dean Martin stumble across the stage at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. He had a glass in his hand, amber liquid sloshing around. He took a sip, made a face, took another sip. His words slurred slightly as he told a joke. The audience laughed. Classic Dean Martin, the lovable drunk, the guy who always had a drink in his hand but never seemed to lose his cool. Nobody in that audience knew they were watching one of the greatest acting performances in entertainment history. Because that glass didn't have whiskey in it, it didn't have scotch, it didn't have any alcohol at all. It had apple juice. For 30 years, from the 1950s through the 1980s, Dean Martin fooled everyone. 18,000 people every night thought they were watching a drunk man perform. Critics wrote about his alcohol-fueled charisma. Fans loved him for being the cool guy who didn't take anything seriously. But backstage, after every show, Dean Martin would go home to his family, stone-cold sober. He'd eat dinner with his wife and children. He'd help with homework. He'd be in bed by 11. The persona was fake. The drinking was fake. The stumbling was choreographed. The slurred words were calculated. Dean Martin spent 3 decades being the most famous drunk in America, and he never had a single drop while performing. How did he pull it off? Why did he do it? And how did one of the biggest secrets in Hollywood stay hidden for so long? This is that story. To understand Dean Martin's greatest performance, you have to go back to the beginning, back to 1946, when Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis became the hottest comedy duo in America. Dean was the straight man, smooth, sophisticated, always cool. He sang beautifully. He looked like a movie star. But early in their act, Dean and Jerry discovered something interesting. When Dean pretended to be slightly tipsy, the audience loved it even more. It started almost by accident. One night in Atlantic City, Dean was singing a romantic ballad. Jerry interrupted him with some physical comedy. Dean, staying in character, acted annoyed. He picked up a glass of water that was sitting on the piano, took a sip, and made a face like it was strong liquor. The audience roared. After the show, Jerry said, "You should do that drunk bit more often." The crowd ate it up. Dean thought about it. You know what? You're right. People love the idea of a guy who's slightly drunk but still completely in control. It's funny, it's charming, and it makes me seem more relaxed. From that moment on, Dean Martin began crafting the persona that would define his entire career. The lovable drunk, the guy who always had a drink in his hand but never seemed to lose his cool. When Dean and Jerry split up in 1956 and Dean went solo, he took that persona with him. By the time he joined the Rat Pack with Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. in the late 1950s, the drunk act was fully developed. But here's what almost nobody knew. It was all an act. Dean Martin had made a conscious decision early in his solo career. He would never drink alcohol during performances. Ever.
Why? Because Dean Martin was a professional. He knew that actually being drunk would make him sloppy. He'd forget lyrics, he'd miss cues, he'd lose control of the audience. And Dean Martin was all about control. So he did something brilliant. He studied drunk people. He watched how they moved, how they talked, how they held themselves. He noticed that drunk people don't stumble randomly. They stumble in specific ways. They overcompensate. They focus really hard on simple tasks. Dean Martin became a student of intoxication, and then he became a master of faking it. The key to the whole performance was the glass. Dean always had a glass in his hand on stage. Always. It became part of his image, his trademark. People would see Dean Martin with that glass and immediately think, "There's Dean having a good time." But what was in the glass? Apple juice. Sometimes it was just water with a tiny bit of food coloring to make it look darker. but most often it was apple juice because the color was right, it looked like whiskey or scotch, and it tasted good enough that Dean could sip it throughout a 2-hour show. The production staff at every venue where Dean performed knew the secret. They'd have bottles of apple juice backstage, they'd pour it into a whiskey glass, they'd hand it to Dean before he walked on stage, and Dean would take that glass and make the audience believe it was Jack Daniels. The stumbling was choreographed. Dean knew exactly when to lose his balance slightly, when to grab the microphone stand for support, when to take a sip and make a face like the liquor was hitting him hard. It was all planned, all calculated, all fake. And it worked brilliantly. For 30 years, nobody questioned it. Nobody thought, wait, is Dean Martin actually drunk right now? They just assumed he was, because that's what they expected to see. That's what the persona promised. The beautiful irony is that Dean Martin's real life was the complete opposite of his stage persona. On stage, he was the lovable drunk who stayed out all night partying. In reality, he was a devoted family man who went home after every show. Dean's second wife, Jean Martin, later said in interviews, he was home every night for dinner, every single night. People thought he was out drinking until dawn, but he'd finish his show and come straight home. He'd have dinner with me and the kids, he'd watch some television, he'd be asleep by 11 o'clock. Dean Martin had 8 children. He was involved in their lives. He went to their school events, he helped them with homework. He was Dad, not Dean Martin the performer, just Dad. His daughter, Dina Martin, wrote in her memoir about the first time she realized her father's drunk act was fake. She was about 12 years old. She'd watched her father on the Dean Martin show the night before. He'd been stumbling around, slurring his words, acting drunk. The next morning at breakfast, she watched him pour orange juice and sit down to read the newspaper. Perfectly normal, perfectly sober. "Dad," she asked, "were you really drunk on the show last night?" Dean looked up from his paper. "What do you think?" "I don't know. You seemed really drunk." "Seemed," Dean said with a smile. "That's the magic word, honey. I seemed drunk, but I wasn't. You know what was in that glass?"
Deanna shook her head. "Apple juice. Same thing that's been in that glass for 20 years. Deanna was shocked. "But everyone thinks—" "Let them think it," Dean interrupted. "It's part of the act, and the act works. Don't tell your friends, okay? It's better if people believe it." And for decades, people did believe it. Even some of Dean's closest friends weren't entirely sure if it was an act or reality. Frank Sinatra, who performed with Dean hundreds of times, was once asked in an interview if Dean was really drunk during their shows. Frank laughed and said, "With Dean, you never quite know. That's what makes him so good. But I'll tell you this, the man never missed a cue, never forgot a lyric, never stumbled at the wrong time. If he was drunk, he was the most functional drunk in history." What Frank was really saying, without saying it directly, was that it was an act. Because Frank knew. The Rat Pack knew. But they kept the secret because that's what performers do. They protect the magic. Joey Bishop, another member of the Rat Pack, was finally asked directly about it in a 1998 interview. The interviewer said, "Was Dean Martin really drunk during your performances?" Joey didn't hesitate. "Never. Not once. I never saw Frank, Dean, Sammy, or Peter drunk during performances. It was all an act. Dean especially. That glass he always had? Apple juice." But that interview happened in 1998, 3 years after Dean Martin died. For 30 years while Dean was performing, the secret held. The genius of Dean Martin's performance wasn't just that he faked being drunk, it was that he understood something fundamental about entertainment. People don't want reality. They want a heightened version of reality. They want a character they can believe in. Dean Martin gave them that character. The cool guy who could drink all night and still be charming. The man who didn't take life too seriously.
the performer who seemed like he was having the time of his life on stage. And because Dean never actually drank during performances, he could deliver that character flawlessly every single time. No missed lyrics, no sloppy mistakes, no real drunkenness that would turn tragic or pathetic. Just the perfect amount of seeming intoxication to be funny and charming. It was method acting before method acting became a thing. Dean Martin became the character so completely that people believed it was real. The Dean Martin Show, which ran on NBC from 1965 to 1974, was built entirely around this persona. Every episode, Dean would come out with his signature glass. He'd slur a few words, he'd pretend to be slightly tipsy, and America loved it. The show was one of the highest-rated programs on television. Dean won a Golden Globe. He became one of the most beloved entertainers in America, all while holding a glass of apple juice. Behind the scenes, the production staff protected the secret religiously. If a new stagehand or crew member asked what was in Dean's glass, the veterans would just say, "Don't ask questions you don't need answers to." The implied message was clear. This is secret. This is important. Don't mess with it. Dean himself never publicly admitted it was fake. Even in interviews, he'd play coy. If someone asked if he was really drunk during his shows, he'd just smile and say something like, "What do you think?" or "A gentleman never tells." He understood that admitting it was fake would ruin the magic. The act even extended to his personal life in some ways. If Dean was out at a restaurant or a party, he'd often order a drink just to maintain the image, but friends later revealed that he'd barely touch it. He'd hold it, maybe take one sip over the course of an hour, but he wasn't drinking, he was performing.
There's a famous story about Dean Martin at a Hollywood party in the 1960s. He was standing at the bar with a drink in his hand, charming everyone around him. A young actor, starstruck at meeting Dean Martin, said, "Mr. Martin, what are you drinking?" Dean looked at his glass, looked at the young actor, and said with perfect comic timing, "I have no idea. I haven't tasted it yet." The room erupted in laughter. Dean Martin being Dean Martin. The drunk who was so drunk he didn't even know what he was drinking. It was perfect. Except Dean knew exactly what he was drinking, because he'd ordered it specifically, and it was probably ginger ale. The question people always ask when they find out about Dean Martin's secret is, why? Why keep up the act for 30 years? Why not just be himself? The answer is complicated. Part of it was marketing. The drunk persona sold. It sold albums, it sold concert tickets, it sold television ratings. People wanted Dean Martin, the character, not Dino Crocetti, the person. But part of it was also protection. The drunk persona gave Dean an excuse to be irreverent, to say things that might otherwise seem rude or inappropriate. If Dean made a joke that pushed boundaries, people would just laugh and say, "Ah, that's just Dean, he's had a few drinks." The persona gave him creative freedom. And maybe, on some level, the persona gave Dean Martin the space to be a private person in public. Everyone was looking at the character, so nobody was really seeing the man. Dean could hide in plain sight behind that glass of apple juice. When Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995, obituaries around the world mentioned his famous drinking persona. But many of them also included quotes from people like Joey Bishop revealing the truth. The secret was finally out. Some fans were disappointed. They felt like they'd been lied to for 30 years. But most people, once they thought about it, were impressed. Dean Martin had pulled off one of the greatest long-term acting performances in entertainment history. He'd made millions of people believe something that wasn't true. And he'd done it so well that even after the truth came out, people still remembered him fondly. Because that's the thing about Dean Martin. Whether he was drunk or sober, the talent was real. The voice was real. The charisma was real. The glass might have been full of apple juice, but the entertainment was 100% genuine.
Today, if you watch old clips of Dean Martin performing, you can see it. The careful way he times his stumbles, the calculated slurring of words, the perfectly placed sips from that glass. Once you know it's an act, you can appreciate just how good the act was. Dean Martin didn't just sing, he didn't just tell jokes, he created a character and lived inside that character so completely that nobody questioned it. For 30 years, through hundreds of concerts, through 9 seasons of television, through countless public appearances. 18,000 people every night, millions of television viewers every week. 30 years, and nobody knew. That's not just entertainment, that's art. The man with the glass full of apple juice convinced the world he was drunk, and in doing so, he became one of the most beloved entertainers of the 20th century, not because of what was in the glass, but because of the performance he built around it. If this story of Hollywood's greatest deception moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with anyone who loves Dean Martin or who needs a reminder that sometimes the best performance is the one nobody realizes is a performance. Leave a comment telling us about a time you discovered something you believed wasn't actually true. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more incredible untold stories about the legends who shaped entertainment history.